Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So I'm on Euston Road in London, or beside it rather, just outside the British Library. And behind me is a statue of Sir Isaac Newton. Doesn't really look like Sir Isaac to me, but anyway, it's dedicated to him. There he is drawing something with his mathematical implement, whatever it is. And he looks to be in a state of undress. What do you think of his hairstyle? Anyway, so Sir Isaac Newton is best known as really the father of modern physics. So he was born at Grantham in Lincolnshire. That's a county about halfway up the east coast of England. Very large rural county, doesn't have a very large population. Now the only other famous person to come from that town was Margaret Thatcher. Of course she was Margaret Roberts. Now, strictly speaking, Newton came from a village a few miles outside the town. He came from a farming family, and when he was very little, his father died. His mother then remarried. So they were not a wealthy family. They're better off than most people, because most people were dirt poor back then. They weren't labourers. They owned a small farm. So he at least got to go to school. And in the 17th century, that did not go without saying, because only about half of people went to school at all. The majority of boys, not a huge majority, and probably a minority of girls. We don't know have very reliable stats on it. But one thing you can look is at marriage registers. Did the person actually sign his or her name, or did the person just make a mark? And that's the only way we can estimate it, really. There was no survey on this kind of thing. So some people had a schooling that was scarcely worth the having, as in sometimes we were taught to read but not to write, and only just go for a couple of years in a huge classroom with almost no teaching materials, writing on slates and no access to books. But anyway, he was well schooled, and his extraordinary talent was noticed, and it came to the attention of the local gentry. So they funded his education, and he got a scholarship to Cambridge University, which was not very far away from where he lived. So he grew up at a time of considerable political upheaval. The English Civil War had been not long before. Then there was Cromwell's rule, the Restoration. Then Charles II, he had no children with his wife, about 20 children with his various mistresses. His heir was James II, and James II had converted to Roman Catholicism, and there was a lot of vicious anti-Catholic prejudice at the time. Should James II inherit or not? And there was attempts to exclude him, the Exclusion Bill, but then Charles II rejected it, and blah, blah, blah. But so he did succeed, James II, and then it was overthrown, the Revolution 1688. Now, Newton managed to keep himself largely aloof from all this. Wasn't a very political person, so he prospered at Cambridge. All the lectures were in Latin, and he learned ancient Greek as well. And people studied a mixture of subjects back then, obviously studying through Latin and occasionally through Greek, but he could really pick and mix what he wanted to do then, as in mathematics, the various sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, botany, things like that, and dip into the art subjects like history, geography, and whatnot. But anyway, obviously his bent was a scientific one, and things were written in Latin because they'd always been written in Latin. Often people think we don't even have an English word for this, even to this day. Well, certainly in law we use the Latin terminology a lot of the time, and a lot of our scientific words are simply anglicised Latin words, or indeed anglicised Greek words. But the other thing is therefore there was this international community of learning. You could have a professor from Sweden come to England, or you could have a lecturer from Ireland go to Croatia, or wherever it was, anywhere in the Western world, whether Catholic or Protestant, academics could read and write Latin. Indeed, it was a spoken language, and then exams were all oral and through the Latin language in those days, partly because paper was scarce and extraordinarily expensive. So Cambridge University was tiny in those days, only a few hundred undergraduates, all male, of course, back then. So he prospered and is immediately offered a fellowship. Eventually became the Lacanian professor of mathematics there, but really we regard him as being into physics and coming up with various discoveries. Well, there's the famous story of the apple on the head. Supposing sitting in his garden, an apple falling on his head, and it was a eureka moment that he realized that there was gravity. Now, some people disputed the veracity of this tale. That he says, well, why did it fall? Well, people say, well, it just falls. Everyone knows that. Things fall to the ground. What goes up must come down. But he said, yeah, but why? There must be a reason. We can't just say it just does. We've got to inquire. And so he said there is this gravity, as in what related to like heaviness in Latin. It must be attracting it to the ground, to the largest object of the ground, towards the center of the earth. So various breakthroughs have been made not long before. Copernicus realizing that the sun was the center of our system and not the earth, which a lot of clergy did not like, but eventually came to accept that. You know, Galilei also getting his bottom smacked on the same issue. And don't imagine that Anglicans over here were more open-minded than Catholics on that one. But then various laws he came up with that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's a bit like, I don't know, if you drop a stone into water, the water's going to come up a little bit like displacement. The same with air and things like that. And also about, well, say, friction and gravity. So supposing you have a cart on a road and you give it a big shove, it's going to go for a while and eventually stop. Why? And people say, well, it just does. Everybody knows it does. It must be a reason why. It just does was not an answer that was going to satisfy him. He kept probing. Well, he realized that friction and obviously being dragged down, and so on. So he came up with his various laws of physics. So he wrote his books in Latin, Principia Mathematicae, if I've got that right, and a few more. So he was in Cambridge most of the time, came down to London, lived in the St James's area, very close to St James's Palace. Unfortunately, the house he lived in no longer stands. That was that. As a fellow of a Cambridge college, he was not permitted to wed. And he did all sorts of experiments, even quite perilous ones, like taking this stick and poking it in between his eye and the skin and towards the back and seeing what the reaction was. Glad he didn't persist with that, because he could have done himself a serious injury. So that was him, an incredibly influential person. Obviously there's Newtonian physics, there's Newton's measurements that's used in physics. So that is Isaac Newton. He was on the banknotes not so many years ago. And really I can't think of anyone else in modern times who's been named Isaac. Why is this here? It wasn't particularly associated with the British Library, which didn't exist at the time. But anyway, there it is, a renowned academic, so he's world famous, honoured, for example, on the Russian State Library. There's an image of him there. I'll switch it off now.